Welcome back to the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we settle in and drift back, far past the clamour of the modern world, to a warm Sunday afternoon in July. The year is 1214. We're travelling to a small, unassuming field in Flanders, France, a place where the fate of 3 kingdoms and the future map of Europe were decided in just a few short, chaotic hours. Imagine the heavy air, thick with the scent of summer dust and the metallic weight of medieval armour. This is the story of Bouvines. It was not just a battle, but a perfect storm of political ambition and desperate revenge. We have King Philip Augustus of France fighting for the very soul of his nation against a colossal multinational army led by his most hated enemy, the excommunicate Emperor Otto IV and 2 treacherous French counts. Close your eyes and let the soft sounds of history wash over you as we explore the clash of loyalties, the fall of an empire, and the surprising victory that birthed the modern French nation while, miles away, unwittingly laying the foundation for the Magna Carta. Breathe deep and let the sounds of 1214 take you to sleep. The sun of July 27th, 1214 would rise over a small village in Flanders, Bouvines, to witness one of the most pivotal and, indeed, dramatic confrontations of the medieval age, an engagement whose ramifications would ripple across the political and constitutional landscape of Europe for centuries. To understand the fury and significance of this single Sunday afternoon, one must first traverse the treacherous terrain of its prelude, the grand, agonizing struggle for dominance that defined the reigns of the 3 principal monarchs involved, Philip II Augustus of France, John of England, and Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. The true genesis of the Battle of Bouvines lies not in a sudden martial clash, but in a slow, inexorable convergence of dynastic ambition, inherited animosities, and the desperate politics of the continental landmass. For decades, the Capetian King of France, Philip, had pursued a singular, relentless objective: the systematic dismantling of the Angevin Empire, that colossal entity built by Henry II of England, which stretched from the Solent to the Pyrenees and controlled more land in France than Philip himself. This vast, intricate web of duchies, counties, and lordships held by the English crown was an intolerable existential threat to the nascent unity of the French kingdom. The loss of Normandy in 1204, following the trial and condemnation of King John by Philip's court, had been a thunderclap moment, a humiliating, epoch-making reversal for the Angevins. It was a wound that festered in the English psyche, a vast territorial, financial, and psychological hemorrhage that King John, the Lackland king, could never forget nor forgive. The loss of Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Touraine, the very cradle of the Angevin dynasty, had fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Philip Augustus was now master of a significantly larger, richer, and more coherent French domain. He had proven himself to be a statesman and military commander of genuine, cold-blooded brilliance, possessing a clarity of purpose that often eluded his contemporaries. His court was increasingly the most feared and respected in Western Europe, and the wealth pouring into the royal coffers from his newly secured lands provided the sinews of war for future campaigns. Meanwhile, King John, often maligned by history, was engaged in a desperate, protracted effort to regain his inheritance, an endeavour that necessitated not merely a military campaign, but the construction of a vast, intricate, and deeply expensive international coalition. John's domestic position was, at best, precarious. His arbitrary rule, his heavy-handed financial exactions, necessary to fund the very war machine he was now attempting to assemble, and his increasingly antagonistic relationship with the English barony and the church had left him isolated and resented. The disastrous conflict with Pope Innocent III, culminating in an interdict over England and John's eventual humiliating submission of his crown to the papacy as a fief, only amplified his reputation for being untrustworthy and impious. The international stage on which this drama unfolded was dominated by the titanic struggle for the Holy Roman Empire, a conflict that provided the essential, indispensable third pillar for the coalition against France. Since the death of Henry VI, the empire had been fractured by civil war between the competing Welf and Hohenstaufen houses. Philip of Swabia, the Hohenstaufen claimant,
had been the long-time ally of Philip Augustus. When Philip of Swabia was assassinated in 1208, the road seemed clear for the wealth candidate, Otto of Brunswick, a nephew of King John. Otto was crowned Holy Roman Emperor as Otto IV in Rome in 1209, a moment that should have brought stability. However, Otto, once crowned, immediately proved that his ambition knew no bounds, threatening to reclaim territories in Italy, which the Pope considered his own. This act of brazen ingratitude and territorial aggression against his former patron caused Pope Innocent III to excommunicate Otto in 1210 and throw his considerable spiritual and political weight behind the young Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, the son of Henry VI, as the new legitimate claimant. This papal reversal was the key that unlocked the Grand Coalition. Otto IV, now a landless excommunicate emperor, saw his only path to survival and recognition in securing a grand victory against Philip Augustus, the one king who still held influence over the German princes. He was, in essence, a desperate man with a title, a king without a kingdom, and an ideal, powerful, yet inherently vulnerable partner for the English king. It was thus that the grand design of the 12 and 14 campaign was born, a vision of war so ambitious, so sweeping in its geographical scope, that it aimed for nothing.
Less than the total dismemberment of the French kingdom and the complete reversal of Philip Augustus's gains. King John, the architect of this colossal undertaking, envisioned a classic pincer movement, a synchronized two-pronged assault designed to split the French forces and divide the attention of the Capetian king. The first prong, the southern and primary thrust, was to be led by John himself. He would land an English army in Poitou, the heart of his remaining continental territories, and march north into the contested regions of Anjou and Touraine, reclaiming the ancestral lands of the Angevins, drawing Philip Augustus southward into a decisive engagement far from the capital. The second prong, the northern and strategically decisive thrust, was to be led by his allies, the excommunicate Emperor Otto IV, Ferrand, the ambitious Count of Flanders, and Renaud of Dampmartin, the powerful and deeply embittered Count of Boulogne. This powerful allied host, a multinational force of German, Flemish, and Anglo-Brabantine contingents, was to descend upon the northern frontier, invading Philip's newly acquired French territories and threatening Paris itself. This combined pressure, the logic went, would overwhelm the French defence, force Philip to fight on two fronts, and ultimately lead to a Capetian collapse. The very composition of this northern allied force reveals the complex, often contradictory, nature of medieval political alliances. Emperor Otto IV represented the might of the Welf dynasty and the vestiges of imperial authority, bringing with him German knights and the fierce, reliable contingent of Brabantine mercenaries under the command of Hugh of Boves. However, his authority was tenuous, his resources stretched, and his very presence a lightning rod for the papal forces. Ferrand, Count of Flanders, was a Capetian vassal who had only recently married a Portuguese princess and was, in an act of breathtaking political treachery, abandoning his liege lord for the English gold that promised him greater independence and territorial expansion. His defection was a massive blow to Philip Augustus, as Flanders possessed the best trained urban militias and some of the most formidable cavalry in Europe. Renaud of Dampmartin, Count of Boulogne, was a figure driven by personal vendetta. He had been a loyal vassal of Philip Augustus, but was alienated by the king's confiscation of his castles and the rejection of his territorial claims. He was a brilliant but volatile military man, possessed of a burning desire for revenge against his former master. These men, united by a common enemy, Philip Augustus, were nonetheless separated by profound personal and territorial jealousies, a fragility that would prove fateful. King John, having assembled his own forces and secured the vast sums necessary to bankroll the entire enterprise, finally embarked for the continent in February of 1214. His landing at La Rochelle was a statement of intent, a dramatic returned to the ancestral heartlands. The initial phase of the southern campaign proceeded much as planned. John, avoiding an immediate confrontation with the French Prince Louis, Philip's son, who was commanding the French forces in the south, launched a series of raids and sieges, retaking important castles and slowly consolidating his position in Poitou and marching toward Anjou. The purpose of this maneuver was not a rapid conquest, but a deliberate, slow-burn campaign designed to draw the main French army southward, away from the northern theatre. By the time John had invested the formidable castle of Roche-aux-Moines in July, successfully besieging it and drawing the attention of Prince Louis, he had achieved his tactical goal. The French crown had been forced to divide its forces, committing a significant portion of its military strength, including the young yet capable heir, to the southern defence. The stage was now set for the northern allies to launch their coordinated strike, the decisive blow that John so desperately required. The grand strategy, despite its massive inherent risks, was, at this moment in early July, unfolding according to the design of the English king. The campaign of the northern allies, however, was characterised from its very inception by a fatal lack of urgency and unity, a stark contrast to the relentless centralised efficiency of the French military command. While John was fighting to draw the French south, the Allied host was assembling at a pace that spoke more of territorial squabbles than military ambition. The powerful contingents of Flanders, the German troops of Otto IV, the Brabantine mercenaries under Hugh of Boves, and the English-funded troops under the Count of Boulogne converged slowly in the Low Countries. The primary point of friction was the inherent tension between the sovereign authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto IV, and the local powerful feudal princes, like Count Ferrand of Flanders. Otto, while nominally the supreme commander, was dependent on these princes for the bulk of his fighting force, and they, in turn, were more concerned with securing their own territorial gains than following a rigid, unified imperial strategy. The Allied army finally began its advance in mid-July, moving into the Capetian territories, but their movement was sluggish, marked by extensive foraging and the looting of the countryside, which, while demoralising to the French populace, did little to advance the core military objective of engaging and defeating Philip Augustus. Philip Augustus, meanwhile, was not a king to be caught unaware. His intelligence network was robust, his loyalty among his remaining great vassals secure, and his understanding of the strategic landscape unparalleled. He had anticipated the two-pronged assault and had already made the crucial, defining strategic choice. He would personally lead the main French army north to meet the greater, more immediate threat posed by the Chiao imperial coalition. The southern front where John was operating he confidently entrusted to his son, Prince Louis. Philip judged correctly that John's southern campaign was a diversion and that the coalition centred on the excommunicate emperor and the powerful Count of Flanders represented the true existential danger to his crown. His decision to commit the main French army north was a testament to his nerve and his military acumen. He was not interested in a slow campaign of attrition, but a decisive war-winning engagement. Leaving the defence of the Loire Valley to Prince Louis and a significant, capable French force, Philip marched his army rapidly northward. His army, while smaller than the combined Allied force, was cohesive, highly motivated, and comprised the traditional strength of the French monarchy. The chevaliers of the royal domain, the militias of the major chartered towns, Paris, Orléans, Laon, and the contingents of loyal, great vassals. The inclusion of the urban militias was a particular hallmark of Philip's policy, representing a powerful, loyal infantry corps that was fiercely committed to the royal cause, a commitment rooted in the charters and privileges granted by the king. This loyalty contrasted sharply with the often mercenary and internally conflicted motivations of the Allied forces. Philip's speed was crucial. He was determined to position his army between the Allied host and the French capital, forcing a confrontation on ground of his choosing, or compelling the enemy to retreat. As the French army advanced, word reached Philip of a disaster averted in the south. King John, having successfully drawn Prince Louis and the French southern force to the siege of Roche-aux-Moines, suddenly found himself in a disastrous situation. The
the English barons, wary of a direct engagement with the French prince and reportedly demoralised by their long campaign, refused to fight. Faced with a numerically superior French force and the mutiny of his own commanders, King John was compelled to order a humiliating rapid retreat, abandoning his siege equipment and leaving the field to Prince Louis. The southern prong of the pincer had collapsed, not due to French military action, but due to internal English disunity and John's failure to command the loyalty of his own men. This pivotal event, which occurred just as Philip was advancing north, allowed the French king to focus his entire attention and resources on the northern threat, transforming the planned two-front war into a single, decisive confrontation in the north. The strategic game was now simple: find the emperor and defeat him. The realization that the French main army, led by King Philip himself, was advancing rapidly toward them, finally stirred the Allied coalition to a greater sense of urgency, albeit one tinged with continued indecision. They had expected to find a weakly defended frontier, or at best an army led by a royal representative, not the full,
galvanized strength of the Capetian crown. The Allied forces, now united geographically, marched southwest from the area around Valenciennes, moving deeper into French territory. Philip, having concentrated his forces around Péronne and Saint-Quentin, positioned his army strategically to block the most direct routes to Paris, and then began a series of manoeuvres aimed at drawing the Allies into a direct pitched battle. He could not afford a protracted campaign of skirmishes and sieges. His victory had to be swift, decisive, and complete. The friction within the Allied command, however, began to intensify as the prospect of battle loomed. Count Ferrand of Flanders and Count Renaud of Boulogne, men of ambition and skill, were deeply entrenched in their own local strategies and tactical preferences, often at odds with the overarching but politically weak authority of Emperor Otto IV. Otto, in his desperation for a swift, overwhelming victory that would re-establish his imperial credibility, was keen for a pitched battle. He commanded the formidable German contingents, men drawn from Saxony and the Rhineland, who represented the professional core of the imperial army, and he held a desperate faith in the sheer numbers of the coalition. The Brabantine mercenaries, led by Hugh of Boves, were known for their brutal effectiveness and utter reliability, but they were also a force motivated purely by plunder, a factor that both increased their fighting ferocity and made them notoriously difficult to control. The Flemish, under Count Ferrand, were perhaps the most numerous, bringing with them both the heavy cavalry of the feudal lords and the formidable pike-wielding urban militias, hardened by decades of civic independence and warfare. Philip, sensing the indecision and the simmering tension within the enemy ranks, initiated a series of calculated movements designed to force the issue. Recognizing that the Allied army, though superior in numbers, was burdened by its own size and complexity, he executed a feigned retreat toward the bridges over the river Lys and the town of Tournai. This movement served a dual purpose. It protected his lines of communication and supply, and more importantly, it was a deliberate provocation. The sight of the French king apparently withdrawing was too great a temptation for the overconfident and internally fractious Allied command to resist. They saw an opportunity for a rout, a chance to fall upon the French baggage train and seize the spoils of war, thus confirming their initial arrogant assumption that Philip would not dare to meet their combined might in open battle. On the morning of Saturday, July 26th, Philip's army was indeed moving eastward, a column stretching long and vulnerable along the ancient Roman road. The Allied commanders, particularly the impetuous Hugh of Boves and the vengeful Count Renaud, saw this as the moment. They convinced the emperor that the French were fleeing and that a rapid pursuit would yield a spectacular victory. Otto, either through poor judgment or simply a desperate desire to end the long stalemate, agreed to the pursuit. The French rearguard, under the command of Philip's skilled marshal, engaged in a series of sharp, tactical skirmishes designed to slow the Allied advance and mask the true French manoeuvre. These actions were crucial, serving as both a check on the Allied enthusiasm and a cover for the main French army's movement. The critical moment of the campaign, the inevitable turning point that dictated the location and nature of the battle, occurred late on the afternoon of July 26th. Philip Augustus had crossed the river Mark at the bridge of Bouvines, a small strategically vital passage. His intention was to continue the march, reaching the safety and fortifications of Tournai, where he could reorganize and await a more opportune moment for battle. However, the reports from his rearguard confirmed the sustained and aggressive pursuit by the Allied vanguard. The Allied army was closer and more committed than Philip had initially calculated, and to continue the march would expose his long column, particularly the valuable baggage train, to a potentially catastrophic attack on the flank. Retreat was now the more dangerous option. It was at this juncture that Philip, renowned for his cold, rational, strategic thinking, made one of the most daring and decisive choices of his career. He ordered the entire French army to halt, turn around, and form up for battle immediately. The decision was not taken lightly. It was a profound act of martial faith. The French army, weary from the day's march and surprised by the sudden order to reverse course, had to execute a complex maneuver under the shadow of an advancing, aggressive enemy. The French banners were planted, the horns sounded the command to array, and the knights and infantry rushed to take up their positions on the relatively open ground west of the River Mark. The battlefield was a classic medieval setting, open fields of grain and pasture, punctuated by occasional woods, and the whole area slightly elevated, offering a modest advantage in visibility. Critically, the River Mark, flowing behind the French, served as a defensive flank, but also, terrifyingly, as a potential trap should the French line break. The Allied command, still convinced they were engaging in a successful pursuit of a fleeing enemy, was caught off guard by the French decision to suddenly stand and fight. The speed of the French deployment was unsettling. Emperor Otto IV and his principal commanders, Ferrand, Renaud, and Hugh of Boves, held a frantic war council. The Emperor and his more aggressive commanders, seeing the French army arrayed before them, argued that the moment for a decisive battle had arrived, that the numerical superiority of the Allied force guaranteed victory, and that to allow Philip to withdraw into the safety of a fortified town would be to lose the strategic initiative entirely. The more cautious voices argued that their forces were exhausted from the pursuit, arriving piecemeal and disorganized, and that a Sunday engagement was both ill-omened and tactically unsound. Yet, the momentum of the pursuit, the lure of an immediate war-ending victory, and the personal animosity against Philip Augustus proved overwhelming. Emperor Otto IV gave the fateful order. The Allied army would form up immediately and engage the French. The field of Bouvines, therefore, was not the result of a meticulously planned clash, but of a sudden, brutal collision of two massive armies, one halting its retreat to fight, the other turning its pursuit into a confrontation. The French army, though slightly smaller, was deployed with a remarkable degree of professionalism and cohesion, reflecting the centralized command of Philip Augustus and his experienced marshals. The Allied army, by contrast, assembled in a sprawling, slightly haphazard fashion, a reflection of the disparate nature of its contingents and the competing loyalties of its commanders. Yet, standing arrayed on the fields of Flanders, the combined might of the Holy Roman Empire, England, Flanders and Boulogne presented an imposing, terrifying sight, a massive multinational host fully committed to the destruction of the Capetian crown. The fate of the French monarchy, the future map of Europe, and the constitutional development of England itself all hung in the balance, resting on the outcome of the battle that would inevitably commence on the following day. As the sun began to set on that Saturday evening, the two armies settled into their positions, the ground between them less than a mile wide, becoming a silent, tense zone of anticipation. The night was spent in a mixture of frantic preparation and deep anxiety. On the French side, the organisation was precise. Philip Augustus, ever the master of propaganda and morale, made a point of addressing his troops, not merely his knights, but also the crucial urban militias. The message was simple but powerful. They were fighting not for a territorial gain, but for the very existence of the Kingdom of France, against an excommunicate emperor and treasonous vassals.
He sought to tap into a nascent sense of French national identity, a loyalty to the crown that transcended feudal contracts. The king, according to contemporary accounts, made an emotional appeal, reminding them that he was their anointed king, and that God would surely favour the just cause against the imperial interloper who had been cast out by the Pope himself. The French army was deployed in 3 distinct and balanced battalions or battle formations. The left wing was primarily composed of the Flemish and French forces of the western counties, under the command of the experienced William de Bar, a knight renowned for his prowess. Their immediate enemy would be the heavily armed Flemish cavalry and the elite English troops. The arquebusade
Centre was the heart of the royal army, directly commanded by Philip Augustus himself. It comprised the best knights of the royal domain, the Capetian standard, the oriflamme, and crucially, the large disciplined infantry contingents from the Parisian and northern urban militias. These militiamen, armed with pikes, spears and crossbows, were positioned to protect the knights and serve as a stabilising anchor for the whole line. The right wing was commanded by the Duke of Burgundy and comprised knights from Champagne and Burgundy, tasked with facing the forces of Renaud of Dampmartin and the fearsome Brabantine mercenaries. This tripartite deployment was orthodox, efficient, and designed to provide a stable front with strategic reserves. On the Allied side, the deployment was also broadly structured into 3 divisions, but with a less unified command. The left wing of the Allies, positioned opposite the French right, was commanded by Count Ferrand of Flanders. This was a force of exceptional quality, comprising the heavy Flemish feudal cavalry and the well-drilled Flemish urban foot soldiers from Ghent and Bruges, renowned for their discipline and ferocity. Their objective was simple: to crush the French right and roll up the line. The centre was the most formidable element, commanded directly by Emperor Otto IV. Here stood the bulk of the Imperial German cavalry, a magnificent heavily armoured force, and the Emperor's personal standard, the Reichsadler Imperial Eagle, carried on a wagon, a symbol of the highest imperial authority. The centre also contained a substantial contingent of German and Lotharingian feudal lords. The right wing was an amalgam of diverse forces under the command of Counts Renaud of Boulogne and Hugh of Boves, facing the French left. This wing was composed of the feared Brabantine mercenary cavalry, English paid knights, and the troops of Boulogne. Renaud, a master tactician, had devised a flexible, slightly detached formation for his men, intending to use the mobility of the mercenaries to flank and harass the main French line. The night was also a period of intense religious observance, particularly on the French side, which sought to emphasise its moral and papal sanction. Priests moved through the French ranks, hearing confessions and granting absolution. This spiritual preparation was not a mere formality. In the deeply religious worldview of the time, the assurance of divine favour was a powerful morale booster, particularly against an excommunicate foe. The king's final proclamation reinforced this. The battle was a holy crusade against an enemy of the church and a traitor to the realm. For the Allies, the atmosphere was different. While confident in their numbers and quality, the imperial army carried the heavy burden of papal excommunication, a psychological disadvantage that was difficult to overcome, despite the promises of immense wealth and power should they prevail. The weight of this spiritual conflict, though invisible, was a palpable presence on the field. The morning of Sunday, July 27th, dawned hot and clear, a bright, intense sun that would beat down upon the combatants throughout the day. The French army, having spent the night in a state of prepared defence, was already fully arrayed. The Allied army was still arriving and completing its deployment, a process that took time due to the length of their marching column and the complex coordination required between the various national and mercenary contingents. At the French camp, a brief but profound moment of uncertainty occurred when the king's advisers urged Philip Augustus to continue his withdrawal, arguing that a Sunday battle was forbidden and ill-advised and that the risk was too great. Philip, however, was resolute. He had already chosen his ground, his army was ready, and he knew that to turn his back on the enemy now would demoralise his men and allow the Allied forces to harass his retreat with impunity. His final word was one of destiny. He had been drawn here, and here he would fight. The Battle of Bouvines, therefore, began not at the initiative of the French, but at the moment the Allied command felt their position was fully established, and their numbers sufficient to guarantee a crushing victory. Around noon, with the sun at its zenith, the Allied skirmishers and missile troops began the engagement, launching arrows and crossbow bolts across the narrow field that separated the two forces. This preliminary exchange was soon followed by the more serious action on the flanks, the initial, thunderous collision of the heavy cavalry. The battle was fought on three distinct and critical sectors: the left, the centre, and the right. On the French left, facing the Allied right, the most complex tactical engagement began. Count Renaud of Boulogne, commanding the Allied right wing, initiated a series of cunning manoeuvres. He had deployed his men, Brabantines and Bolognese, in a detached formation, a highly mobile shield wall of foot soldiers interspersed with cavalry, designed to draw out and envelop the French flank. The French left, led by William de Bar, a man whose bravery was only matched by his occasional impulsiveness, was drawn into a furious, swirling cavalry melee. The fighting here was characterized by its ferocity and chaos, a testament to the hatred between the French commanders and the Count of Boulogne. Renaud, fighting with the desperation of a traitor, was the focus of the French attack. The fighting was so intense that the French initially suffered significant losses, particularly among the light cavalry. The key objective for the French was to prevent Renaud's formation from truly outflanking them and wheeling in behind the French centre, a danger that would expose Philip Augustus himself. De Barres and his knights, fighting a hard defensive battle, managed to hold the line, pinning the mobile Allied right wing and preventing the decisive manoeuvre that Renaud had planned. Simultaneously on the French right, facing the Allied left, the clash was a brutal head-on collision of heavy feudal cavalry. The French contingent, led by the Duke of Burgundy, faced the powerful, well-trained Flemish knights commanded by Count Ferrand. The Flemish, widely regarded as some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, charged with ferocity, their initial impact driving the Burgundian forces back in disorder. The Duke of Burgundy's troops were pushed almost to the point of breaking, and the Count of Saint-Pol, another French commander, was forced to commit his strategic reserve early to shore up the collapsing flank. This part of the field became a massive, grinding engagement between two blocks of heavily armoured horsemen, a test of pure strength and endurance. The Flemish fought with the determination of men who knew they were fighting for their territory and their count, but the arrival of the French reserve stabilised the line, turning the initial rout into a desperate stationary slugfest. The sheer weight and momentum of the combat here tied down a massive portion of the Allied army, preventing Count Ferrand from lending his strength to the main event in the centre. The centre was where the battle would be decided, the crucial sector where the two sovereigns, Philip Augustus and Emperor Otto IV, faced one another directly. The engagement here began with a massive charge by the elite German Imperial Cavalry, the very core of Otto's army. They were aiming directly for the French royal banner and the king himself. The attack was driven not merely by military strategy, but by the emperor's desperate need to secure the person of Philip Augustus and end the war with a single dramatic stroke. The initial German charge, a thundering wave of heavy horsemen, smashed into the French centre. The first line of defence was composed of the French urban militias, the loyal foot soldiers of the communes. These men, arrayed in a dense pike and spear formation, absorbed the full, terrifying impact of the imperial cavalry. The militia held their ground with extraordinary, unexpected tenacity. They were farmers, craftsmen and burghers, not professional soldiers, but their loyalty to the king and the privileges he had granted them gave them a fierce resolve. The sheer density of their formation and the hedge of their long weapons broke the initial momentum of the German charge. However, the pressure was immense, and the German cavalry, disoriented but not defeated, began to punch holes in the French infantry line. As the German knights surged forward, they breached the screen of the foot soldiers and pressed directly toward the king. It was here that the crisis of the battle occurred, a moment of profound, terrifying drama that defines the narrative of Bouvines.
A group of German knights led by a man named Pierre Mauvoisin managed to cut their way through the final line of royal bodyguards and
reach King Philip Augustus. The chroniclers recount the scene with vivid intensity. A mounted German knight used a hooked weapon, a grappling hook or a lance with a sharpened point, to pull the king from his saddle. Philip, clad in full armour, was dragged from his horse, falling heavily to the ground and disappearing beneath the press of bodies and the dust of the combat. A cry of terror and alarm spread through the French ranks in the centre. The king is killed, or the king is captured. The royal standard, the oriflamme, began to waver, and the French centre was on the very brink of collapse. But the loyalty of the French knights proved to be the Capetian crown's salvation. 2 knights, Peter Tristan and Galon de Montigny, threw themselves immediately into the fray, fighting off the German attackers with a desperate ferocity. They managed to protect the king's prone body until the royal foot soldiers, seeing the danger to their sovereign, surged forward to create a protective barrier. Philip, regaining his feet, was immediately remounted by his knights, his banner raised higher once more, and his presence on the field reaffirmed. The sight of the king, uninjured, remounted, and back in the thick of the fighting, electrified the French centre. The brief moment of panic was replaced by a surge of furious determination, an act of collective, righteous vengeance against the Germans who had dared to touch the anointed person of the king. The near catastrophe had been averted, and the French centre, now fighting with a renewed, almost fanatical zeal, pushed back against the German tide. The failure to capture or kill Philip Augustus was the single greatest error made by Emperor Otto IV and the turning point in the central engagement, transforming a potential French rout into a Capetian counterattack. The momentary terror that had swept through the French centre upon the sight of their king unhorsed gave way to a wave of vengeful, almost fanatical fury. The German knights who had accomplished the near-fatal deed momentarily exultant found themselves suddenly isolated, engulfed by a seething tide of French chevaliers and resurgent communal infantry. This was no longer a tactical engagement, but a personal vendetta for the honour of the anointed king. The knights who had dared to lay hands upon the sacred person of Philip Augustus were immediately cut down or captured. Peter Tristan, Galon de Montigny, and Stephen of Longchamp, the men who had protected the king's life, now led the counter-charge with the ferocity of men redeemed by a successful defence. Philip, remounted upon a fresh war-horse, did not retreat to a position of safety, but pressed forward with his retinue, his very presence an electrifying defiance that steadied the faltering oriflamme and galvanized his entire central division. This dramatic reversal in the centre was immediately felt throughout the battlefield. The German imperial cavalry, previously confident in their powerful thrust, found their momentum utterly arrested. Their wedge, which had successfully pierced the French line, was now jammed, surrounded, and subjected to a relentless, coordinated assault. The communal infantry, the milices of the chartered towns, particularly those from Paris, Orléans and Laon, having redeemed their king from capture, fought with a savage effectiveness that surprised even their own commanders. They moved into the gaps created by the initial German charge, using their long pikes and guisarmes to hamstring horses and drag heavy armoured knights to the ground, where they were dispatched with terrible efficiency. The German heavy cavalry, formidable in an open charge, became cumbersome and vulnerable in the close-quarter press of the melee, struggling to manoeuvre their horses and swing their heavy swords against the determined foot soldiers swarming about their stirrups. Emperor Otto IV, positioned slightly behind the main thrust of his German vassals, watched the success of the initial breach turn into a catastrophic failure. The news that Philip had been unhorsed only to be remounted seconds later robbed him of his moment of triumph and plunged him into a state of desperate rage. Otto was a man whose claim to the imperial throne rested entirely on a single, overwhelming martial success. He was excommunicated, politically marginalized, and despised by many of the German princes who were only supporting him now out of financial necessity or shared hatred for the Capetian king. He could not afford a stalemate. He
He could not afford a slow, grinding withdrawal. His only salvation lay in the annihilation of Philip Augustus. The moment of the French king's near capture was the high watermark of the Allied cause, and as it receded, Otto realised with a chilling clarity that the battle was rapidly turning against him. His immediate response was not tactical withdrawal, but a reckless, personalised act of defiance. He gathered his remaining elite German retainers, the most loyal knights of the Welf cause, and prepared to plunge directly into the most furious part of the central engagement, intending, it seemed, to achieve single-handedly what his initial massive charge had failed to do. This act of personal commitment, though militarily unsound, reveals the depth of the emperor's desperation, a desperation fueled by the realization that Bouvines was his last best chance to seize the very destiny he believed was his by right. While the centre devolved into a brutal, confused struggle for the bodies of knights and the person of the king, the conflict on the flanks intensified, revealing the core of the Allied strategy and the inherent fragility of their disparate command. On the Allied right, facing the French left, the tactical genius and simmering rage of Count Renaud of Damartin, Count of Boulogne, manifested in a unique and dangerous formation. Renaud was the quintessential aggrieved vassal, a man driven by a profound personal sense of betrayal by Philip Augustus, who had confiscated his castles and treated his claims with contempt. His hatred for the Capetian king was a powerful, dark energy that focused his military mind. Renaud's formation was unorthodox, a calculated risk that relied on superior discipline and mobility. Instead of a solid block of cavalry, he had created a schiltron of his own design, a dense core of foot soldiers, including archers and spearmen, surrounded by a mobile screen of his Boulognese and the elite Brabantine mercenary cavalry, led by the ruthless Hugh of Boves. The mercenaries were, in effect, a mobile strike force, whose mission was to use their renowned horsemanship to break French formations with swift, repeated charges, while the infantry shield wall provided an anchor and protection. This formation was designed to be a perpetual irritant, refusing to be pinned down by the heavier French feudal cavalry and allowing Renaud to execute the flanking manoeuvre that was essential to the overall Allied plan. The French left, commanded by William des Barres and the Count of Dreux, men equally renowned for their ferocity, found themselves engaged in a frustrating, bloody melee. Des Barres in particular was a nemesis of Renaud, and their forces collided repeatedly with profound personal animosity. The French knights struggled against Renaud's mobile shield. Each French charge was met by a shower of missiles from the infantry, followed by a fierce, contained countercharge from the Brabantines, before the Allied forces swiftly retreated into the protection of their own shield wall. The fight became a series of grueling individualized duels and small-scale cavalry skirmishes, rather than a decisive, sweeping charge. Renaud's disciplined defence and the savage efficiency of the Brabantines, who fought purely for gold and plunder, meant that the French left was effectively pinned down, unable to break through and threaten the flank of the Allied centre, but equally unable to be decisively outflanked themselves. The true story of the Allied strategy was embodied in this confrontation, a conflict fuelled by the personal political betrayal of the Allied commanders. Renaud's motivation was purely revenge. He was fighting not for the empire, but for the restoration of his own honour and domain. Hugh of Boves, the mercenary captain, was motivated solely by the vast sums of English gold promised by King John. The performance of their combined force was a testament to their individual skill, but their commitment was ultimately brittle, tied to personal survival and profit rather than dynastic loyalty. This fragile foundation, the reliance on external factors rather than shared national purpose, was the flaw that Philip Augustus had wagered against, and as the battle in the centre began to turn, this brittle alliance on the right would face its ultimate test. The Brabantines, professional soldiers of fortune, were expert in assessing the changing tides of battle, and the safety of their plunder was always their highest priority. Across the battlefield on the Allied left, the confrontation between the French right and the Flemish host was proving to be the most physically taxing and relentless of the three sectors. Here,
The sheer quality and density of the troops guaranteed a grinding, prolonged slugfest. Count Ferrand of Flanders, the Capuchin vassal who had committed the ultimate feudal sin of treachery against his liege lord, commanded an army whose composition was fundamentally different from the German and Brabantine forces. Ferrand's contingent included the finest heavy cavalry of his own feudal lords, but its unique strength lay in the massive, disciplined infantry of the great Flemish cities, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres. These milices communales were not peasants pressed into service, but well-equipped, highly trained urban soldiers, whose civic independence had been hard won in previous skirmishes, and whose loyalty was fiercely committed to their count and their communal privileges. The French right, commanded by the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of St. Pol, faced a formidable opponent. The initial Flemish charge, a massive, coordinated assault by their heavy horsemen, had been devastating, pushing the French line back almost to the point of collapse. The fighting was so compressed and violent that the noise of the impact, the shattering of wood, the clang of steel on steel, the bellowing of men, was described by chroniclers as a terrifying, continuous roar. The Duke of Burgundy, a man of courage but who often struggled with the tactical discipline of his feudal contingent, found his men hard-pressed. It took the timely commitment of St. Pol's reserve forces to prevent a complete rout and to stabilise the French flank. The core of the fight soon settled into an attempt by the French to break the cohesion of the Flemish ranks. The French chevaliers were renowned for their individual prowess and reckless courage, but the Flemish fought with a disciplined unity that often frustrated the more individualistic French style of combat. The pivotal moment in this sector arrived when the French managed to execute a coordinated attack against the Flemish standard, attempting to cut off the Count from his reserves. This was not merely a symbolic attack. In medieval warfare, the loss of the standard and the physical separation of the commander from his men often resulted in immediate panic and rout. The defence of the Flemish standard was heroic, but ultimately futile against the relentless French pressure. The Count of St. Pol, focusing his entire energy on breaching the line, led a sustained assault that began to erode the edges of the Flemish cavalry. The fighting here was exceptionally personal. Ferrand, fully armoured and fighting in the thickest part of the melee, was a man who understood that his betrayal had placed his entire territory and life on the line. He fought with the desperate courage of a man who could not afford to retreat or surrender. His commitment was matched by the infantry, who, even as the cavalry around them began to waver, maintained their tight, pike-bristling formations, making themselves a deadly stationary target that the French struggled to dislodge. The contest on the French right was a test of feudal loyalty against territorial and political independence, and the French, unified behind their king, began to slowly, agonizingly gain the upper hand. The fury of the centre, where the battle's fate was truly being forged, saw its climax in the desperate final attempts of Emperor Otto IV to salvage his lost cause. Having witnessed the failure of the mass charge and the subsequent collapse of the imperial spearhead, Otto resolved upon a personal, almost suicidal action. He had been promised the recognition of the papacy and the support of the German princes in exchange for a decisive victory. A defeat meant utter ruin. He could not and would not be seen to flee while the battle was yet undecided. The emperor, flanked by his most devoted German retainers, knights from the wealth heartlands of Saxony and Brunswick, charged directly toward the French royal position, now firmly established and reinforced. This was not a tactical charge aimed at a weak point, but a direct, brutal, personalized attack aimed at King Philip Augustus. The emperor's standard, the golden imperial eagle upon the dragon-crowned wagon, was pushed forward, a beacon of imperial authority, demanding recognition and obedience from the fragmented allied forces. The emperor's war cry was said to be heard above the din, a desperate assertion of his title and legitimacy against the Capetian king who denied it. The collision of this secondary imperial charge with the French centre was as violent as the first, but less effective. The French, forewarned and fighting with the confidence of their recent success, were ready. The German knights, led by their emperor, plunged into the melee, and once again the immediate target was the person of the king.
In the ensuing struggle, an event of profound symbolic significance occurred. The imperial standard carried aloft on its wagon became the focal point of the French counterattack. A band of French knights and men-at-arms, led by the Knight Gervais de Tilleul, managed to hack their way through the German guard and attack the imperial eagle itself. They toppled the standard wagon, pulling down the magnificent banner. The fall of the Reichsadler was, in the context of the Holy Roman Empire, a disaster of monumental proportions, the symbol of imperial legitimacy lying prostrate in the dust of Flanders. This symbolic act mirrored the immediate danger faced by Otto himself. He was engaged in a fierce, confused brawl, surrounded by French knights determined to capture or kill him. A French knight, Pierre de la Tournelle, lunged with his sword, striking the
Emperor's horse in the head. The massive war horse recoiled violently, causing Otto to lose control. At the same moment, another knight, probably from the French communal militia, used a dagger or short sword to wound the horse in the flank. The wounded animal, terrified and uncontrollable, reared and bolted, wheeling away from the epicenter of the combat, carrying the desperate emperor with it. Otto, unable to check the flight of his horse, was effectively swept away from the field. The sight of the emperor's banner fallen and his person violently separated from the battle line shattered the morale of the German centre. The core of their formation, driven by loyalty to the Welf cause and the person of Otto IV, instantly dissolved into panic. Knights who had fought valiantly minutes before now saw only the signs of utter defeat, the fallen standard, the flight of the commander, and the relentless, bloodthirsty charge of the French. The German centre, the most powerful and professional core of the Allied army, broke and fled the field, leaving the Flemish and Bolognese contingents to their fate. The flight of Otto IV was the definitive moment of the battle's decision, sealing the doom of the entire Allied coalition. The collapse of the imperial centre provided the opportunity for the first and most critical manifestation of the fundamental conflict between the Allies, the mercenary instinct versus the feudal necessity. As the German corps broke and fled, Emperor Otto IV was being swept away in the desperate tide. The two remaining Allied flanks, the Flemish under Ferrand and the composite force of Boulogne and the Brabantines under Renaud and Hugh of Boves, were left isolated and exposed. The French now had the strategic freedom to concentrate their reserves and reinforce the flanks, turning the general melee into two distinct, decisive assaults. The most egregious display of Allied disunity occurred on the Allied right, commanded by Renaud of Boulogne and the mercenary captain Hugh of Boves. Hugh of Boves, an experienced and ruthless commander of fortune, had led his Brabantine mercenaries with great skill and ferocity throughout the morning, executing Renaud's mobile tactics perfectly. However, the Brabantines were paid to fight, not to die, and their loyalty was exclusively financial. As soon as the imperial standard fell and Otto IV's German knights began their panicked rout, Hugh of Boves made a cold, immediate calculation. The battle was lost, and the French would now turn their full fury upon the remaining isolated contingents. Without consultation and driven entirely by the imperative to preserve his men and the substantial plunder they had already acquired during the campaign, Hugh of Boves gave the order for the Brabantines to disengage. It was a rapid, complete, and utterly treacherous desertion. His mercenaries, disciplined in their retreat as they had been in their attack, broke formation and fled the field en masse, heading north toward the safety of the Flemish territories. They abandoned their commander, Count Renaud of Boulogne, and his loyal Boulognese knights, leaving them exposed and alone to face the vengeful French left and the now liberated reserves of the French centre. The impact of this desertion was immediate and devastating to Renaud. His carefully constructed formation, the mobile shield wall, relied entirely on the presence of the Brabantine cavalry to execute the rapid, disorienting strikes that kept the French at bay. With their sudden flight, the heart of his mobility was ripped out. Renaud and his knights were left stranded, their infantry corps immediately vulnerable to the French heavy cavalry. This act of mercenary treachery, the ultimate conflict between the Allies, demonstrated the inherent weakness of a coalition built on gold and shared hatred rather than shared destiny. The mercenaries chose profit and survival over the fate of the coalition and the life of their immediate commander. For Renaud, whose fight was purely for personal redemption, this betrayal compounded the tragedy of his final stand, turning a strategic engagement into an isolated, doomed sacrifice. The French left, sensing the sudden vacuum, charged with renewed force, intent on finishing the battle they had struggled with all morning. The decisive end to the conflict on the French right soon followed the collapse of the centre and the flight of the Brabantines. The Duke of Burgundy, now reinforced by fresh troops from the French centre who were no longer needed against the demoralised Germans, pressed his advantage relentlessly against the Flemish. The fighting here remained intense, focused on the capture of Count Ferrand, the architect of the betrayal of his French sovereign. The Flemish knights, though fighting with immense courage and skill, were now being hammered on two sides: the frontal assault of the Burgundians and the constant pressure of the French reserve seeking to envelop their flank. The capture of Count Ferrand was a moment of high drama and crucial symbolic value. A French knight named John of Nesle, having cut his way through the Flemish guard, managed to reach the Count's person. In the fierce melee, Ferrand's horse was killed, bringing the Count down into the dust. As he struggled to regain his feet, he was surrounded by French knights and men-at-arms, disarmed and taken prisoner. The loss of their leader, the physical symbol of their cause, immediately broke the will of the Flemish feudal cavalry. Many of them followed the example of the Brabantines and turned their horses to flee, seeking safety in the northern reaches of Flanders. However, the resistance of the Flemish urban militias proved far harder to extinguish. The foot soldiers of Ghent and Bruges, having formed tight, disciplined squares and phalanxes, were driven not by feudal loyalty, but by their fiercely independent communal spirit and a visceral hatred for the French royal power that threatened their prosperity. They maintained their formation even as the Flemish cavalry streamed past them in full flight. The French heavy cavalry, masters of the charge, struggled immensely against these disciplined, pike-wielding infantry formations. The cost of engaging them directly was too high. The knights' horses would not charge into the hedge of spears, and the infantry, even when attacked, maintained their cohesion. It took a coordinated effort involving repeated, exhausting attacks by the French communal infantry, the very troops who had saved the king in the centre, to finally break the Flemish squares. This was a battle between commoners, Frenchmen against Flemings, a demonstration of the power of national loyalty against communal independence. Slowly, systematically, the Flemish ranks were compressed, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Those who did not surrender were cut down or trampled. The ultimate defeat of the Flemish contingent was a prolonged, bloody affair, a testament to the resilience of the urban militias, but by late afternoon the entire French right was secure. With Ferrand captured and his formidable army shattered, the strategic integrity of the Allied left wing ceased to exist. Philip Augustus had now secured both his centre and his right, leaving only the doomed resistance of Count Renaud of Boulogne on the field. The flight of Emperor Otto IV was not merely a tactical retreat, it was an abandonment of his army, his allies, and his imperial ambition. Swept away by his wounded, bolting horse, he was pursued for a short distance by a handful of French knights. Contemporary accounts describe his desperate ride across the fields, the sight of the fallen imperial eagle and the fleeing German centre burning into his memory. He managed, with his few remaining loyal retainers, to escape the immediate battlefield and rode relentlessly north and east, seeking refuge in the comparative safety of the German territories. His campaign, his coalition, and his claim to the imperial throne had been irrevocably shattered in the space of a few hours. Bouvines was, for Otto IV, the definitive end of his power, a humiliation from which he would never recover, his presence on the field now reduced to a fugitive shadow. The conclusion of the main action in the centre allowed the French forces to execute the critical manoeuvre that sealed the fate of the remaining Allied contingent, the encirclement of Count Renaud of Boulogne. Having successfully routed the German corps and secured the person of the king, the French centre now wheeled left, joining forces with the French left,
which had been locked in a bloody stalemate with Renaud's formation all morning. Renaud and his loyal Boulognese knights, already reeling from the sudden, inexplicable desertion of their Brabantine allies, now found themselves facing the concentrated, converging fury of almost the entire French army. Renaud's unique tactical formation, which had been his strength, now became his fatal weakness. His force was too rigid to retreat effectively and too exposed to withstand a concerted attack from multiple directions. He had sought to create an unassailable strongpoint, a static fortress designed to bleed the French and allow for flanking manoeuvres. With the flanks gone, his fortress was surrounded. Recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, yet driven by the very personal honour that had led him to treason, Renaud and his remaining knights refused to surrender. They formed a final, desperate defensive circle, placing their remaining foot soldiers at the perimeter and preparing to fight to the death. This final stand was a brutal, protracted affair. The French, infuriated by Renaud's stubborn resistance and the high cost he had extracted from the French left, attacked with pitiless efficiency. They used their heavy cavalry to smash repeatedly against the tight, isolated formation, while the foot soldiers, fresh from their victory over the Flemish, moved in to dismantle the Boulognese defensive perimeter piece by piece. The battle had now entered its mopping-up phase, a prolonged execution of the remaining traitors. The sun began to dip in the sky, casting long, bloody shadows across the field, but the fighting continued until the final resistance was extinguished. The tragic final chapter of the Battle of Bouvines belonged to Count Renaud of Boulogne. Isolated, abandoned, and facing the vengeance of his former sovereign, his complex formation of knights and infantry was slowly, systematically torn apart by the overwhelming French numbers. Renaud, fighting on foot after his horse was killed, continued to command and fight with a desperate, dark courage, making his personal defence a testament to his burning hatred for Philip Augustus. He had fought not for gold, but for revenge, and his refusal to yield was absolute. The end came when Renaud, bleeding from multiple wounds, was finally separated from his remaining bodyguards. A French knight, said to be a Burgundian named Philip of Dreux, succeeded in bringing the count down. Renaud was immediately surrounded, disarmed, and taken prisoner. The chroniclers relate that he was brought before King Philip Augustus, a final poignant confrontation between the victor and the most embittered of the defeated vassals. The king, having secured his ultimate victory, gazed upon the man who had betrayed him and sought his ruin. With the capture of Renaud, the last organised resistance on the field of Bouvines ceased. The Allied coalition was not merely defeated, it was utterly destroyed. The battlefield itself presented a scene of total carnage. The sheer density of the fighting, particularly in the centre and on the French right, had resulted in a high casualty rate, though the majority of the losses fell upon the Allied side. The flight of the Brabantines and the Germans saved many lives, but the fate of the Flemish and
Boulogne's contingents, who chose to fight to the bitter end, was catastrophic. The French victory was complete. Two Allied commanders, Count Ferrand of Flanders and Count Renaud of Boulogne, were captured. A third sovereign, Emperor Otto IV, was a fugitive in full retreat, and the massive multinational army assembled by King John had been annihilated. The political and symbolic significance of the victory was immediately apparent. Philip Augustus, riding through the field with his triumphant army, was hailed not merely as a victorious king, but as the divinely favoured sovereign of France. His near-death experience in the centre transformed into a narrative of miraculous protection. The captured standards, especially the mighty imperial eagle of Otto IV, were gathered as trophies of unparalleled value, physical symbols of the king's dominion over his realm and his rejection of imperial authority within French borders. The battle, fought on a relatively obscure field in Flanders, had decisively ended the century-long struggle between the Capetian and Angevin dynasties for control of France, securing Philip's vast territorial gains. For King John of England, who was nowhere near the field, the news of the disaster was the ultimate ruin of his continental ambitions and his carefully constructed grand strategy. The collapse of the northern prong meant that the entire, massively expensive coalition had failed,
rendering his successful southern campaign utterly irrelevant. His defeat at Bouvines, executed by his allies, would send him back to England financially ruined and politically isolated. The consequences of this defeat would resonate far beyond the battle, leading directly to the baronial rebellion that culminated in the signing of the Magna Carta in the following year, fundamentally altering the constitutional development of the English state. Bouvines, therefore, was not merely a battle for France, it was a battle for Europe, a definitive moment that established the French monarchy as the dominant continental power and set England on the path toward constitutional monarchy. The Battle of Bouvines concluded not with a whimper but with the utter cessation of organised Allied resistance, leaving the fields of Flanders strewn with the dead and the captured, and the very air ringing with the victorious shouts of the French. Yet the true drama of Bouvines was only beginning as the sun set on that fateful Sunday. The immediate aftermath transformed from a scene of martial chaos into a monumental logistical and political undertaking, demonstrating the administrative efficiency of the Capetian monarchy. Philip Augustus, ever the calculating sovereign, did not indulge in prolonged revelry. His first and most crucial task was to secure the extraordinary bounty that had fallen into his hands, not just the enemy banners and equipment, but the prized prisoners of the highest rank, the living proof of his divine favour and military supremacy. The
tally of high-ranking captives was unprecedented for a single medieval battle, confirming the thoroughness of the Allied defeat. Chief among them were the two great feudal lords who had betrayed the French crown, Count Ferrand of Flanders and Count Renaud of Boulogne. Their capture was the definitive personal triumph for Philip Augustus, extinguishing the immediate threat of internal rebellion backed by external power. Alongside them were figures of immense symbolic weight and political consequence. Hugh of Boves, the mercenary captain, had managed to flee, but other powerful German nobles and imperial vassals, including several counts and knights of high standing, were among the captured. Most significant, however, was the seizure of the imperial eagle, the Reichsadler, Otto IV's personal banner. Its capture was not merely a trophy, it was the physical proof that the French king had directly defeated the Holy Roman Emperor in open combat, a claim to prestige and sovereignty that resonated across every court in Europe. The process of managing the prisoners was swift and decisive. Ferrand and Renaud, as traitors to the crown, were treated with the particular severity reserved for oath-breakers. They were swiftly secured and transported under heavy guard towards the royal prisons. Their fate would not be a swift execution, but a long, agonizing political limbo, maximizing the strategic leverage they represented. The other high-ranking captives, the German and Flemish nobles, became valuable assets for ransom, a vast financial windfall that would not only cover the expenses of the campaign, but further enrich the royal treasury, securing the financial independence of the Capetian crown for years to come. The lower-ranking prisoners, the foot soldiers and less wealthy knights, were often dispatched or released on the field, their military utility having ceased. Philip Augustus thus leveraged his victory immediately, turning defeated enemies into capital, both political and financial, a testament to his pragmatic genius. The celebratory return of King Philip Augustus to Paris in the days following the battle was not merely a parade, but a carefully orchestrated propaganda event designed to forge a powerful, nascent sense of French national identity and solidify the Capetian narrative of divine right. The king's procession from Bouvines to the capital became a triumphant, slow march through the newly secured territories, a powerful visual demonstration of the crown's control and the extent of the victory. Every town and village on the route turned out in force, transforming the procession into a spontaneous, overwhelming outpouring of joy and relief. The true spectacle, however, was reserved for the entry into Paris. The streets were hung with tapestries and flowers, the churches rang their bells incessantly, and the population poured out, cheering the returning hero. At the head of the procession were the most critical symbols of the victory: the captured imperial eagle and the prominent noble prisoners. The sight of Count Ferrand of Flanders and Count Renaud of Boulogne, the most notorious traitors, marched in chains, offered a visceral public reassurance that treason would be punished and royal authority upheld. The Flemish Count Ferrand in particular was paraded in a wooden cage, a deeply humiliating and unforgettable spectacle of a defeated rebel. This display was crucial for domestic consumption, cementing the loyalty of the French baronage and reassuring the urban militias of their privileged place in the king's new order. The centre of the triumph, however, was the figure of Philip Augustus himself. He was hailed by the clergy and the populace as Philip the God-given, a monarch protected by divine providence, whose near-fatal unhorsing was recast as a miraculous intervention. The victory at Bouvines, fought on a Sunday, the Lord's Day, and against an excommunicated emperor, was framed as a religious vindication of the Capetian dynasty. This narrative was deliberately cultivated by the royal court and the clergy, effectively transforming a complex feudal engagement into a holy crusade for the independence and sovereignty of France. This emphasis on divine sanction was a potent weapon against future rebellions, elevating Philip's authority beyond mere feudal contract to one of sacred duty. The psychological impact on the French populace was immense. Bouvines was seen as the culmination of generations of struggle, securing France's borders and establishing the Capetian king as the preeminent legitimate sovereign of the realm. The battle thus became a founding myth for the French nation-state, a powerful narrative of unity and destiny. While Philip Augustus enjoyed the apotheosis of his triumph, the two key figures of the Allied coalition faced profound and divergent consequences: the definitive end of Emperor Otto IV's reign and the crippling political fallout for King John of England. For Otto IV, the flight from Bouvines was the last chapter of his imperial career. He rode eastward, disgraced and demoralised, reaching his wealth territories in Brunswick, but the moral and military defeat was absolute. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire, who had only grudgingly supported the excommunicate Welf, immediately recognised the decisiveness of the French victory. They interpreted the fall of the Reichsadler and the Emperor's flight as clear signs of divine rejection. Within months of the battle, the German princes, led by the clergy and those eager to align with papal authority, formally withdrew their allegiance from Otto IV. They threw their full support behind the young Hohenstaufen claimant, Frederick II, who was already backed by Pope Innocent III. Otto IV, stripped of his imperial title and his political support, retreated to his ancestral lands, where he maintained a shadow court until his death 4 years later. Bouvines thus served as the decisive military confirmation of the papal policy, ending the devastating German Civil War and ushering in the long influential reign of Frederick II, dramatically altering the course of German and Italian politics. The Capetian victory had, paradoxically, secured the ascent of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, demonstrating the vast, unexpected ripple effect of the engagement. The impact on King John of England was arguably more profound and direct. News of the disaster in the north reached him while he was in the midst of his now futile campaign in the south. The northern prong, the linchpin of his colossal strategy, had been destroyed, rendering his own successful manoeuvre in Poitou meaningless. John's primary objective, the recovery of Normandy and Anjou, was now an impossibility. Faced with a now undivided and victorious French army under Prince Louis in the south, John had no choice but to negotiate a humiliating truce and retreat back to England in the autumn of 1214. The truce, signed at Chinon, officially conceded all of John's territories north of the Loire, Normandy, Anjou, Maine and Touraine, recognising Philip Augustus's conquest of 1204 as permanent. Bouvines was the military seal on the disintegration of the original Angevin Empire. The strategic failure and financial ruin wrought by the Bouvines campaign proved to be the final catastrophic misstep for King John in the eyes of his own English barons. John returned to England not as a conqueror, but as a humiliated king who had spent vast sums of money extorted through years of heavy taxation and arbitrary rule, only to suffer a crushing, final defeat. The campaign had demanded unprecedented financial exactions,
known as the scutage and other feudal aids, which had inflamed the English nobility and clergy. The sheer expense, calculated to be equivalent to several years of the crown's normal revenue, yielded nothing but political humiliation and the permanent loss of the ancestral continental lands. The failure at Bouvines provided the necessary trigger and justification for the English barons to transition from sullen resentment to active rebellion. The barons had long resented John's arbitrary justice, his abuse of feudal rights, and his failure to protect their continental holdings. The defeat stripped John of his prestige, his financial leverage, and, most critically, his military options. Without the vast resources provided by the continental lands, and with his mercenary forces depleted, John was suddenly vulnerable. The barons, emboldened by the king's political weakness and galvanized by a sense of common grievance, began to organize immediately after John's return. The culmination of this baronial revolt was the forced signing of the Magna Carta Libertatum, Great Charter of Liberties, at Runnymede in June 1215. The charter was a revolutionary document that sought to limit the arbitrary power of the king and establish fundamental principles of law, placing the monarch under a framework of legal accountability. It guaranteed specific rights to the church, limited the crown's power to demand taxes such as the scutage used to fund the Bouvines campaign, without general consent, and established the principle of habeas corpus and due process, the famous Clause 39, guaranteeing that no free man shall be imprisoned or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. The Battle of Bouvines, therefore, was not just a French victory. It was the direct catalyst for the first great constitutional limitation on royal power in English history. The victory of Philip Augustus secured the consolidation of the French state, while the defeat of John initiated the long and distinct development of the English constitutional monarchy. The long-term effects of the Capetian victory at Bouvines were, for France, transformative and indelible. The battle secured the newly expanded Capetian domain, guaranteeing the French control over the vast and rich territories of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. This consolidation of territory was the single greatest factor in the rise of France as the dominant political and military power in Western Europe for the remainder of the Middle Ages. The king's domain, the lands directly administered by the crown, now encompassed the historical heartland of France, providing Philip Augustus with an unparalleled financial and demographic base. The wealth generated by these new lands, coupled with the massive ransoms extracted from the prisoners taken at Bouvines, fueled the centralizing and modernizing efforts of the French monarchy. Philip Augustus used this enhanced revenue to create a more sophisticated professional administrative system, relying on salaried officials, the bailli and sénéchaux, rather than volatile feudal lords. This shift from a reliance on the unpredictable feudal levy to a more stable professional civil service was a crucial step in the development of the French state. The victory cemented the Capetian policy of state building, laying the economic and administrative foundations for future strong French kings. Moreover, Bouvines forever altered the delicate feudal balance between the king and his great vassals. The imprisonment of Ferrand of Flanders and the utter destruction of his army provided a terrifying precedent. Treason would be punished with total ruin, and the king's authority was now militarily unchallengeable. The vassals who had remained loyal, like the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Saint-Pol, were rewarded handsomely, reinforcing the concept that loyalty to the crown brought immense rewards. This military triumph thus completed the political victory Philip had initiated years earlier, transforming the King of France from a mere primus inter pares, first among equals, into the absolute, unquestioned master of his kingdom. Bouvines confirmed the end of the age of the great independent principalities within France and the beginning of the age of the unified, centralized, and powerful Capetian state. The strategic and symbolic repercussions of the battle rippled far beyond the immediate theatres of France and England, deeply affecting the political landscape of the Low Countries and the legacy of the Welf dynasty. The capture of Count Ferrand and the destruction of the Flemish milices had a profound, immediate, and destabilising effect on Flanders.
The Flemish county, one of the wealthiest and most commercially active regions in Europe, was now placed under the direct, harsh supervision of the victorious French crown. Ferrand remained a prisoner for over a decade, confined in the Louvre, his fate a constant symbol of French dominance. During Ferrand's lengthy imprisonment, Flanders was governed by a regent appointed by Philip Augustus, who imposed extremely unfavourable economic and political terms on the county. French influence ensured that the vast textile wealth of Flanders, which relied heavily on English wool, was redirected, strengthening French economic power and severely weakening the Flemish city's independence. This period of French control fostered deep resentment among the Flemish population, particularly the powerful urban guilds, leading to future conflicts between the wealthy cities and the French crown that would last for centuries. The seeds of these future struggles directly sown on the field of Bouvines. For the Welf dynasty and the remnants of Emperor Otto IV's support, Bouvines was an unmitigated disaster that permanently curtailed their aspirations to the imperial throne. Though Otto IV would cling to life and his title until 1218, his authority was non-existent. The Welf defeat established the Hohenstaufen dynasty under Frederick II as the undisputed imperial line for the next 4 decades. This shift meant that imperial policy would be focused heavily on Italy and the Mediterranean, a development that drew the Holy Roman Empire away from active involvement in the politics of northern France and the Low Countries, further securing Philip Augustus's northern frontier. The battle, therefore, had the singular effect of defining the political boundaries of the German Empire and the French kingdom, removing the former's ability to interfere decisively in the affairs of the latter. Bouvines solidified a fundamental geographical distinction between the two great powers of continental Europe. Beyond the immediate political and territorial shifts, the Battle of Bouvines offered an array of invaluable military and logistical lessons that would influence medieval warfare for generations. Firstly, the battle provided a powerful affirmation of the value of the communal infantry and their capacity to withstand the shock of heavy cavalry. The French urban militias, particularly those from Paris, had saved the life of Philip Augustus and prevented the centre from collapsing against the German charge. This success was a decisive victory for the wise commoners and their fighting potential, demonstrating that organised, disciplined foot soldiers armed with pikes and spears were capable of defeating the most fearsome European heavy cavalry. This realization would lead to a slow but steady increase in the strategic importance of infantry in warfare, challenging the unquestioned dominance of the mounted knight. Secondly, the battle underscored the absolute necessity of unified command and national loyalty against the inherent fragility of mercenary heavy coalitions. The French army, fighting under a single decisive sovereign, Philip Augustus, and driven by a growing shared loyalty to the crown and France, operated with remarkable cohesion. In stark contrast, the Allied coalition collapsed due to the personal animosities of its commanders, Ferrand versus Renaud, and the ruthless pragmatism of its mercenary contingent, Hugh of Boves and the Brabantines. The instant desertion of the Brabantines upon sensing defeat proved that gold could buy military skill but not commitment, a costly lesson for future monarchs who would rely on large mercenary armies. Finally, Bouvines cemented the reputation of Philip Augustus as a master strategist. His ability to anticipate the two-pronged assault, delegate the defence of the south to his son, and then march rapidly north to force a decisive confrontation on ground of his choosing was a tactical masterpiece. His disciplined, well-managed forces, his excellent intelligence network, and his political shrewdness in leveraging papal sanction against the excommunicate Otto IV all contributed to a victory that was as much an administrative and political triumph as it was a martial one. The battle became a case study in medieval military history, teaching future commanders the importance of speed, logistics, and singular focus in campaigning. The enduring legacy of the Battle of Bouvines is not simply the recounting of a medieval military clash, but its role as a pivotal hinge point of European history, a battle whose consequences were truly transformative across 3 distinct realms: France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. For France,
Bouvines secured the Capetian dynasty's position, transforming the kingdom from a collection of powerful, semi-independent feudal territories into a cohesive, centralized state. It marked the definitive end of the Angevin threat and established France's dominant geopolitical position on the continent. The king was confirmed as the Rex Christianissimus, the most Christian king, his authority both temporal and divine, setting the stage for the absolute monarchy of the later centuries. For England, the defeat was the immediate trigger for a constitutional crisis, directly leading to the Magna Carta, a document of world historical importance that established the rule of law and the principle of limited government. The loss of the continental lands forced the English monarchy and nobility to focus inwards, cultivating a distinct,
insular identity that would eventually contribute to the development of English common law and parliamentary governance, permanently severing their historical ties to the continent. For the Holy Roman Empire, the battle resolved the Welf-Hohenstaufen conflict in favour of Frederick II, ensuring the long reign of a powerful emperor who would prioritise Italy, thus strategically disengaging the empire from direct interference in the Western European power dynamic. Bouvines, in essence, cleared the stage for the independent development of the great Western European nation-states. In the span of a single afternoon, the fate of 3 thrones, the map of Europe, and the constitutional path of England were irrevocably decided. It was a victory not just of arms, but of strategy, logistics, and political narrative, a moment that solidified the French kingdom, weakened the English crown, and decided the fate of the empire. The cheers that greeted Philip Augustus in Paris were not just for a battle won, but for the beginning of a new, Capetian-dominated European order that would last for the rest of the medieval age. The significance of Bouvines remains the enduring, central lesson, a clash of arms that achieved more than any diplomatic treaty, securing the future of France and inadvertently setting the foundations for modern constitutional governance in England. The political and personal wreckage of Bouvines was nowhere more starkly embodied than in the fate of Count Ferrand of Flanders. His capture, immediately following the collapse of his formidable Flemish cavalry and the ultimate subjugation of his city militias, represented a seismic shift in the balance of power in the Low Countries and a profound personal humiliation for a man who had briefly aspired to total independence from the French crown. Ferrand, the Capetian vassal who had committed the ultimate feudal treachery by accepting English gold and declaring war upon his liege lord, was not granted the dignity of a nobleman's immediate release or swift private justice. Instead, Philip Augustus chose a punishment that was both politically exemplary and psychologically crushing. Ferrand was paraded in the triumphant march back to Paris in a manner calculated to maximize his shame and demonstrate the futility of resistance. Accounts describe him being confined in a specially constructed wooden cage, a barbaric but effective symbol of his fallen status, subjected to the jeers and hatred of the very populace whose king he had sought to overthrow. This public humiliation was not merely punitive, it was a potent piece of political theatre, warning every remaining French vassal, from the powerful Duke of Brittany to the smallest lord, that the consequences of treason against the newly asserted, divinely sanctioned Capetian authority would be absolute and agonizingly protracted. Upon arrival in Paris, Ferrand was not executed, a course of action that might have elevated him to the status of a martyr. Instead, he was incarcerated in the Grand Tower of the Louvre, the massive fortress and symbol of royal power being constructed by Philip Augustus. His prison sentence would stretch for over a decade, a period of unrelenting political limbo. During his confinement, Philip Augustus systematically dismantled the political and economic autonomy of Flanders. The French king installed a regent loyal to the crown who ensured that the vast commercial wealth of the Flemish cities, derived primarily from the lucrative wool trade, was exploited to serve Capetian interests. Heavy ransoms and fines were imposed upon the Flemish communes and nobility, effectively turning the most prosperous county in northern Europe into an economic tributary of the French crown. Ferrand's decade-long imprisonment in the Louvre served as a constant, grinding pressure point, maximising the French king's strategic leverage,
securing the northern frontier against any renewal of the English-Flemish alliance, and ensuring the permanent subservience of the Flemish domains. Ferrand's story is one of spectacular ambition crushed by superior power, a clear and chilling lesson in the high cost of feudal disobedience to the ascendant Capetian state. The fate of Count Renaud of Boulogne was a different tragedy entirely, a narrative of deep-seated personal vendetta culminating in a final defiant act of war. Renaud was not merely a financial opportunist like Ferrand, but a highly skilled military man driven by a profound psychological grievance against Philip Augustus. His treason stemmed from a long history of perceived slights, territorial disputes, and the king's confiscation of his castles, transforming him from a powerful Capetian loyalist into a bitter, implacable enemy. His commitment to the Allied cause was absolute, fueled by a singular, consuming desire for personal revenge, making his role in the coalition one of volatile dedication. The manner of his resistance at Bouvines, as detailed in the previous section, reflected this desperate commitment. His complex, rigid defensive formation, relying on a mobile shield wall of Brabantines and Boulognese, was a testament to his tactical brilliance, designed to pin and bleed the French left. His final stand, after the cowardly desertion of Hugh of Boves and the collapse of the imperial centre, was not a strategic retreat but a hopeless, isolated sacrifice. He fought on foot after his horse was killed, refusing the option of surrender until he was literally overwhelmed by French forces, wounded and captured. His defiance was so absolute that when brought before his former sovereign, no words of supplication or remorse are recorded, only the silent, stubborn fury of a man whose destiny had been destroyed by his own pride and vengeance. Unlike Ferrand, whose importance lay in his territorial control, Renaud's value to Philip was primarily symbolic. He was the traitor par excellence, a man who had deliberately
sought the life of the king and the ruin of the realm. His punishment was designed to break his spirit completely. He was held in the darkest and most secure dungeons, allegedly chained to the walls of a castle tower, often referred to as the Château de Laon. This was not merely imprisonment, it was an isolation designed to crush his will. His fate was to linger, a warning etched in stone and iron to any vassal who contemplated personal war against the crown. Accounts suggest that his final years were marked by a profound melancholy, a proud spirit slowly decaying in confinement. Renaud's story is a darker, more personal corollary to Ferrand's political ruin, demonstrating that Philip Augustus was as capable of exacting personal vengeance as he was of securing political leverage. The fate of these two major traitors, imprisoned in the heart of the royal domain, served as the physical manifestation of the newly centralized Capetian judicial and military authority. The narrative of Bouvines, often dominated by the spectacle of chivalric combat, frequently overshadows the true, unsung hero of the French victory, the superior logistical and administrative genius of Philip Augustus. The king's ability to win the battle relied less on luck and more on his careful systemic reform of the royal administration over the preceding decade. The rapid and decisive deployment of the main French army from the centre of France to the Flemish border in mid-July 1214, a distance of several hundred kilometres, was a logistical feat that the sprawling multinational Allied force could not match. Philip's victory was built on the back of his salaried royal officials, the bailli and seneschaux. These men, appointed to administer the royal domain rather than inheriting their posts, provided a centralized, efficient, and loyal network across the kingdom. As the army advanced rapidly north, this established administrative framework ensured that the troops were continuously and reliably supplied. Unlike the Allied army, which often relied on dispersed foraging and the consequent alienation of the local populace, the French army moved along secure lines of communication, with food, fodder, and replacements pre-positioned or efficiently requisitioned through the bailes. This logistical stability allowed Philip to maintain the morale and speed of his army, ensuring that they arrived at Bouvines prepared for battle, not exhausted by a campaign of scarcity. Furthermore, Philip's sophisticated system of intelligence was key to his deployment. He was consistently well informed of the enemy's slow, disorganized movements and King John's strategic intentions. This accurate real-time intelligence allowed him to make the crucial strategic decision to entrust the south to Prince Louis and commit his main force to the north, focusing all his energy on the greater imperial threat. The logistical efficiency was thus intrinsically linked to the strategic's brilliance. Philip's reformed administration provided him with the necessary speed and information to force the battle on the day and ground of his choosing, catching the dispersed and marching Allied army completely off guard. The victory at Bouvines was, in a very real sense, the culmination of a decade of bureaucratic modernization, demonstrating that effective administration was the sine qua non of medieval military success. The decisive advantage of the French army was fundamentally rooted in the superior financial health and centralized revenue stream of the Capetian crown, a factor that distinguished Philip Augustus's war effort from the costly, debt-ridden, and ultimately unsustainable campaign of King John. The French victory was, in part, a triumph of financial engineering. Philip had systematically centralized the revenues of the royal domain, particularly those flowing from his recent rich conquest of Normandy and Anjou, securing a level of financial independence unmatched by his predecessors. This wealth allowed Philip to employ a professional corps of troops, particularly reliable mercenaries, and, most importantly, to fully fund and arm the massive contingents of urban militias. Unlike the imperial and English armies, which relied heavily on expensive, often unpredictable feudal levies and gold-hungry Brabantine mercenaries who fought only for plunder, the French crown could afford to pay, equip and sustain a large cohesive force. The funding of the communal militias was a shrewd political and military investment, buying the loyalty of the cities with charters and privileges, and in return securing a dedicated non-feudal infantry corps. King John's campaign, by contrast, was a story of financial desperation and exhaustion. He had been forced to extract enormous, unprecedented sums from the English nobility through arbitrary scutage, feudal payments in lieu of military service, and punitive taxation, alienating the very barons whose support he needed. He spent exorbitant amounts on retaining the Allied commanders, Emperor Otto, Ferrand, and Renaud, whose loyalty was conditional and whose forces were ultimately unreliable. The defeat at Bouvines thus represented the total destruction of King John's entire financial edifice, leaving him bankrupt, discredited, and defenceless against the subsequent baronial revolt. Philip's victory was sustainable, built on a steady stream of domestic revenue. John's failure was inevitable, built on a temporary loan of hatred and gold that brought only fleeting, ultimately treasonous loyalty. One of the most profound military lessons of Bouvines, and a crucial element of Philip Augustus's political foresight, was the decisive and unexpected role played by the French urban militias. These contingents of foot soldiers drawn from the newly enfranchised cities of the royal domain, Paris, Orléans, Soissons, Laon, were the antithesis of the traditional individualistic feudal knight. Their success against the imperial heavy cavalry on that Sunday afternoon was a turning point for the social dynamics of medieval warfare. The militias were motivated not by feudal contract or personal glory, but by a collective sense of loyalty to the king who had granted their towns valuable charters, granting them political autonomy and economic privilege. They saw themselves as defenders of the communal rights, and by extension the royal cause that guaranteed those rights. Their motivation was fiercely ideological, leading to a cohesion and tenacity that far surpassed that of the aristocratic levies. Their crucial intervention occurred in the centre, when the German charge pierced the lines and pulled King Philip from his horse. It was the massed ranks of the Parisian and northern communal infantry who surged forward to form a protective wall around their fallen sovereign. Their tightly packed phalanxes of spearmen and pikemen were able to withstand the shock of the heavy horsemen, using their long weapons to hamstring horses and drag armoured knights to the ground. This deliberate, disciplined resistance, aimed at saving the person of the king, was the decisive action that stabilised the French centre and allowed the royal cavalry to counterattack. The success of the militias was a validation of Philip's policy of fostering the towns as a reliable counterweight to the volatile
feudal nobility. Bouvines demonstrated that the common man, fighting for his chartered rights under the king's banner, was a force capable of turning the tide of battle against the best cavalry in Europe, fundamentally changing the future composition and strategy of the French army. The psychological warfare surrounding Bouvines was as critical as the military strategy, and here Philip Augustus possessed a singular overwhelming advantage: the religious dimension of the conflict. The entire Capetian war effort was draped in the mantle of divine favour and sanctioned by the highest ecclesiastical authority. Philip Augustus was fighting an excommunicate emperor, Otto IV, a man cast out by Pope Innocent III for territorial aggression against the papacy. Philip and his clergy masterfully exploited this reality. Before the battle, the French king presented himself not merely as a sovereign defending his realm, but as the faithful champion of the Church and the designated agent of divine justice against a condemned enemy. Priests moved through the French ranks, offering general absolution and framing the upcoming combat as a holy endeavour, akin to a crusade. This spiritual preparation was a profound morale booster. The French soldiers believed they were fighting with God on their side, absolved of their sins, and assured of a heavenly reward should they fall. In contrast, the Allied army was fighting under the banner of a politically and spiritually discredited emperor. While Otto IV and his German princes undoubtedly had their own spiritual advisors, the cloud of excommunication was a heavy, debilitating psychological burden. Their cause lacked the essential moral legitimacy that animated the French troops. When the imperial eagle fell and Otto IV fled, it was immediately interpreted by French and Allied forces alike as a clear sign of divine judgment. The king's near capture, instantly followed by his escape and the German collapse, was swiftly transformed into a Capetian miracle. The religious narrative ensured that the victory was perceived across Europe not just as a military success, but as the unmistakable vindication of the Capetian dynasty and the sovereignty of the Kingdom of France, permanently enhancing the king's moral and political authority. A deeper analysis of the battle reveals that the Allied defeat was not merely due to the French counterattack, but was fundamentally rooted in the tactical failures and internal conflicts of the Allied command. The key errors were a combination of the emperor's desperation, the treachery of the mercenaries, and the geographical overconfidence of the Flemish. Emperor Otto IV made the cardinal error of transitioning too quickly from a successful pursuit to an immediate, unplanned pitched battle. His desperate need for a swift, decisive victory blinded him to the exhaustion and disarray of his arriving troops. By committing the elite German cavalry corps prematurely and aiming a direct linear charge at the person of the French king, he risked the entire imperial cause on a single, high-stakes thrust. When that thrust was arrested by the French infantry and Philip remounted, Otto had no meaningful reserve or tactical alternative. His flight, driven by fear and panic, completed the dissolution of the centre. Count Ferrand of Flanders, though commanding the strongest contingent, was overly confident in the martial superiority of his Flemish knights and communes. His deployment was powerful but geographically narrow, too focused on the immediate task of crushing the French right rather than coordinating a deep tactical manoeuvre with Otto's centre. He allowed his formidable force to be pinned down in a grinding attritional fight, preventing him from providing the crucial flank support that could have turned the tide in the centre. Most damagingly, the reliance on Hugh of Beauvais and the Brabantines created a structural weakness. Renault's sophisticated tactical plan relied entirely on the loyalty and manoeuvrability of these mercenaries. Hugh of Beauvais's calculated self-serving desertion, instantly prioritising his own survival and plunder over the life of his commander, Renault, and the fate of the coalition shattered the Allied right. This event perfectly illustrated the intrinsic failure of the Allied strategy, a coalition of powerful individuals, each fighting for their own narrow interests, lacked the political and moral cohesion necessary to defeat the centralised, unified power of the Capetian crown. The strategic and judicial aftermath of
Bouvines was meticulously managed by Philip Augustus, turning the battlefield victory into a permanent political reality. The high-profile prisoners were not merely ransom material, they were trophies of state and instruments of policy. Their confinement in the newly built royal castles, particularly the Louvre in Paris, served as a constant physical reminder of the crown's ultimate authority. The treatment of Ferrand and Renaud, in particular, went beyond medieval custom. They were not merely defeated foes, they were tried and convicted traitors. Ferrand's lengthy imprisonment allowed Philip to effectively integrate Flanders into the French sphere of economic and political influence without resorting to the long, costly process of a siege and conquest campaign. Renaud's fate served as the ultimate judicial precedent, that the King of France had the right and the power to judge and punish his great vassals, even to the point of perpetual imprisonment for the crime of treason. This exercise of judicial supremacy completed the military and administrative centralization of power. The ransoms extracted from the captured German and Flemish nobles poured wealth directly into the royal treasury, reinforcing the financial strength demonstrated during the campaign. This wealth allowed Philip to continue his program of castle building, administrative reform, and expansion of the royal domain, securing the fruits of the victory permanently. The enduring story of Bouvines is thus the establishment of the Capetian king as the supreme military, administrative, judicial, and moral sovereign within his realm. The small village in Flanders had become the anvil upon which the French nation was forged, permanently altering the destiny of France and its neighbours. The ultimate conclusion of the Battle of Bouvines, while defined by the grand sweep of political consequence, is best understood through the prism of individual valour and the specific human dramas that unfolded in the thickest part of the melee. The French victory was not an abstract administrative triumph, but the result of the extraordinary courage displayed by King Philip Augustus' most loyal knights, men whose actions on that Sunday afternoon secured their sovereign's life and, with it, the fate of the entire Capetian kingdom. The narrative of the centre, where Philip was nearly lost, is punctuated by the stories of those who fought not for land or ransom, but for the immediate defence of their anointed king, an act that defined the nascent loyalty to the French crown. The heroism of Pierre Tristan and Galon de Montigny stands paramount. These were the knights, members of the king's personal guard, who reacted with instant, desperate ferocity when the German knight, Pierre Mauvoisin, dragged Philip from his saddle. Accounts describe their immediate suicidal charge into the hostile German wedge, forcing their way to the prone body of the king. Their intervention was not merely reactive, it was an act of profound martial devotion, sacrificing their own tactical advantage to create a desperate, fleeting shield around their sovereign. Tristan and Montigny, joined by the infantry, successfully held the German knights at bay, providing the crucial seconds necessary for Philip to be recovered and remounted. Their actions exemplify the new intense loyalty being cultivated by the Capetian king, a loyalty that transcended the purely transactional nature of earlier feudalism. Another figure whose action proved crucial was Guérin, Bishop of Senlis. Though a cleric, Guérin served as Philip's chief minister and strategist, possessing a cool, detached military acumen that belied his ecclesiastical title. He was the man who, on the field, managed the crucial deployment of the French troops, particularly ensuring the communal militias were positioned correctly to absorb the imperial charge. During the crisis in the centre, Guérin, positioned near the king, maintained his composure, using his influence to rally the demoralised troops and ensuring that the reserves were committed precisely where they were needed most. His ability to oversee the chaos and issue effective orders provided the structural cohesion that the German assault lacked. Guérin's dual role, spiritual advisor and military commander, underscored the intertwined nature of the Capetian cause and divine providence, cementing the narrative that the French victory was divinely guided. The French success on the flanks, particularly the eventual breakthrough on the right against the fearsome Flemish, was marked by its own specific acts of heroism, providing a stark counterpoint to the disciplined desperation of the centre. The long, grinding struggle against Count Ferrand's host, the elite Flemish feudal cavalry and the resolute urban militias, required relentless, individual prowess and tactical patience.
The final capture of Ferrand was a moment of supreme individual courage, the reward for the sustained pressure applied by the French feudal aristocracy. The knight credited with the ultimate capture of the traitorous count was John of Nesle, a figure whose name became synonymous with the king's vengeance. Nesle, leading a sustained cavalry assault, managed to pierce the Flemish guard and reach the count, unhorsing him and facilitating his immediate capture. This act was not a random stroke of luck, but the culmination of a fierce, sustained effort by the French commanders on that flank, including the Duke of Burgundy and Count of St. Pol. St. Pol in particular displayed the tactical foresight necessary to commit his reserves at the most critical juncture, preventing the initial Flemish charge from completely routing the French right. His ability to stabilise the line and sustain the pressure against the Flemish cavalry was as vital as the defence of the king. These instances of individual heroism across the field, the defensive loyalty of Tristan and Montigny in the way.
Centre, the strategic guidance of Guérin, and the offensive breakthrough of John of Nesle and St. Pol on the right were meticulously recorded and celebrated by the Capetian court. They served as vital propaganda, creating a pantheon of heroes dedicated to the unified French state. The stories elevated the battle beyond a mere clash of feudal armies, establishing a tradition of royal service and chivalric devotion that would be central to the French identity for centuries to come, directly linking personal honour to the destiny of the crown. The immediate tactical failure of the Allied coalition at Bouvines was compounded by the deeper structural issue of their lack of a unified command structure and the conflictual nature of their objectives. While the flight of the Brabantines was the most egregious example of disunity, the strategic failure was baked into the coalition's very design. The Allied army consisted of 4 fundamentally distinct forces, each with conflicting motives and priorities. Emperor Otto IV's Germans. Driven by desperation to reclaim the imperial title, they sought a swift, total victory over Philip Augustus, without much concern for the territorial interest of their allies. Count Ferrand's Flemish. Primarily motivated by the desire to break free from French vassalage and secure territorial gains, their objective was provincial and focused solely on the northern frontier. Count Renaud's Boulognese. Driven by personal vendetta, their objective was the physical defeat and humiliation of Philip Augustus. Hugh of Beauvaise's Brabantine mercenaries. Motivated purely by financial gain and self-preservation, their objective was to survive and profit. This internal disharmony translated directly into operational paralysis. The Emperor's desperate charge, which failed, was not adequately supported by Ferrand, who was locked into a grinding conservative fight. Renaud's sophisticated flanking manoeuvre was ultimately betrayed by the most unreliable component of his own force. The Allied leaders failed to establish a clear chain of command or a cohesive battle plan that transcended their individual grievances. Philip Augustus, by contrast, commanded a force united by singular loyalty and a shared strategic goal, with authority clearly vested in the king and his efficient marshals. This contrast in command and control was arguably the most significant non-material factor in the French victory. The immediate post-battle scenes surrounding the disposition of the defeated leaders serve as the final, illustrative chapter in the story of Bouvines, cementing the political and judicial supremacy of Philip Augustus. The triumphant procession's entry into Paris was a deliberate piece of statecraft, the Capetian version of a Roman triumph, designed to overawe the populace and project unchallengeable power. The manner in which the 2 chief traitors were transported speaks volumes about Philip's understanding of propaganda and psychological warfare. Count Ferrand, as the ruler of a wealthy, important county, was given the dignity of the most visible humiliation, paraded in a cage. This public spectacle was meant to convey the finality of the king's control over his wealthy vassals and their rich domains. The message was clear: no wealth, no army, and no external ally could save a traitor from the king's justice. Ferrand's incarceration in the Louvre was an act of economic and political genius, allowing Philip to exploit Flanders' wealth and influence without the cost of a long siege. The ransom, when finally paid over a decade later, was extortionate, securing French financial interests for a generation. Count Renaud received a more profound personal punishment. His deeper, more personal animosity towards the king warranted a more brutal, private fate. His long, grim imprisonment, often in chains in a remote dungeon, was a warning to those vassals whose grievances went beyond the political and strayed into the realm of personal vendetta. He was allowed to live, but stripped of all honour and influence, a symbol of the spiritual and political death of the rebellious vassal. Philip Augustus understood that to create a unified state, he needed not just military might, but the power to inflict symbolic and exemplary judicial punishment, thereby extinguishing the spirit of feudal independence. The long shadow of Bouvines extended with particular weight over the subsequent development of English political identity following King John's retreat. The disaster in Flanders did not merely bankrupt John, it fundamentally altered the psychological disposition of the English aristocracy. For over a century, the primary focus of the Anglo-Norman and Angevin nobility had been continental, the maintenance of their cross-channel estates, and the political manoeuvring required to hold together the vast Angevin Empire. Their identity was rooted as much in the duchies of Normandy and Anjou as it was in the Kingdom of England. The permanent loss of Normandy and the decisive humiliation at Bouvines forced a brutal and necessary reorientation. The English barons, now confined almost exclusively to the island realm, were compelled to focus their political energy inward. The continuous demands for money and the arbitrary rule of a failed king who had wasted the nation's wealth for a lost cause became intolerable. The defeat catalyzed a unified aristocratic opposition that was now distinctively English in its focus, no longer distracted by continental holdings. The resulting baronial revolt and the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 were the direct constitutional fruit of this military defeat. The very clauses of the Charter, limiting the king's ability to levy scutage and extraordinary aids without consent, were a direct response to the massive, ruinous taxes demanded by John to fund the failed Bouvines campaign. The historical consensus holds that by ending the Angevin Empire in France, Philip Augustus inadvertently set England on a unique political trajectory, forcing the development of constitutional checks on monarchical power and laying the foundation for parliamentary governance. The victory for French statehood was simultaneously a foundational moment for English liberty. To understand the scale of the French triumph, it is necessary to consider the material gains and financial leverage that Bouvines provided to the Capetian crown, solidifying the administrative reforms already undertaken by Philip Augustus. The victory was, in many ways, an enormous transfer of wealth and resources from the empire and Flanders directly into the royal coffers. The ransoms collected from the high-ranking German and Flemish nobles constituted a massive one-time influx of cash. This wealth was immediately reinvested into the state-building projects that defined Philip's reign, constructing massive fortresses, urban improvements in Paris, including the first paved streets and the completion of the Louvre fortress, and, crucially, maintaining a larger, more reliable professional army. This financial independence allowed Philip to escape the cycle of feudal debt and reliance that had crippled previous French monarchs. Moreover, the securing of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, confirmed by the treaty following the battle, was an even greater long-term economic prize. These territories were amongst the wealthiest in Europe, rich in agricultural lands and urban centres. Their revenues, now centralised under the Capetian administration via the baillie, ensured that the French royal domain possessed a permanent financial superiority over any potential internal or external rival. The economic prosperity guaranteed by Bouvines was the engine that powered the rise of France throughout the 13th century, enabling the country to support the cultural and political flowering of the high medieval age. The battle's influence on medieval military strategy and tactics was profound, marking a critical moment in the transition from purely feudal warfare to a more organised professional approach. While the heavy cavalry charge remained the centrepiece of engagement, Bouvines forcefully demonstrated the vulnerability of knights to disciplined massed infantry. The tenacity and effectiveness of the French communal militias against the Imperial German cavalry were a revelation. It proved definitively
that a coordinated body of foot soldiers, fighting with strong morale and clear purpose, could disrupt and defeat the most fearsome shock troops of the era. This validation of infantry power encouraged French monarchs to continue investing in urban militias and later in professional non-feudal foot soldiers, shifting the balance of military power away from the great feudal lords and towards the centralized crown. Furthermore, the battle served as a cautionary tale regarding the operational logistics of large armies, the Allied failure
to coordinate their attack. Their slow march and their reliance on foraging contrasted sharply with the French army's rapid, well-supplied movement. Philip Augustus's emphasis on speed and administrative support became a model for future military campaigns, emphasizing that victory depended as much on the efficient management of men and material before the battle as it did on courage during the engagement. Bouvines demonstrated that the age of the simple feudal levy, reliant on short-term service and chaotic logistics, was drawing to a close, replaced by a preference for standing forces and bureaucratic efficiency. In synthesizing the immense legacy of the Battle of Bouvines, one must recognize its nature as a true hinge point in Western history. It was far more than a military victory. It was a defining moment of national, political, and constitutional realignment across Europe. For the Kingdom of France, Bouvines was the birth of the nation-state. It secured the territory, centralized the power, and validated the divine right of the Capetian monarchy, laying the unshakable foundation for future French greatness. Philip Augustus, riding back into Paris, secured the territorial boundaries and political destiny of France for the next 5 centuries. For the English crown and nobility, the defeat marked a necessary, painful end to their continental ambitions, forcing a pivotal focus on internal constitutional development. The resultant Magna Carta ensured that the defeat of King John became a victory for the rule of law, setting England on a political course fundamentally different from its continental neighbours. For the Holy Roman Empire, the battle effectively ended the Great Civil War, settling the imperial question in favour of the Hohenstaufen line, and ensuring that the empire's political focus would drift south and east, away from France. The wealth power was broken, and French sovereignty was permanently secured against imperial interference. The enduring image of Bouvines is not the clash of steel, but the parade of the captive Count Ferrand in his wooden cage, and the quiet, simultaneous drafting of the Magna Carta in the wake of the news. The events of that single Sunday afternoon in 1214 solidified the borders of modern Europe, established France as the dominant continental power, and inadvertently championed the cause of English liberty, confirming its place as one of the most consequential, albeit often overlooked, battles of the medieval era. The victory of Philip Augustus was complete, decisive, and irreversible, setting the course of Western civilization for generations to follow.